Well, it is a pleasure to be joined by Dr. Jeffrey Arthurs. He's the Robinson Chair of Preaching and Communication, Director of the Haddon W. Robinson Center for Preaching at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary outside of Boston. Always a pleasure to talk with Jeff about preaching. And today, he's written numerous books, but today we're going to be talking about this one in particular, How to Preach Narrative. This is my well-worn copy, very highlighted copy of How to Preach Narrative. Jeff, I appreciate you spending some time here talking about narrative messages.
Thank you. And thanks for buying that book and thumbing through it. Maybe you'll wear it out and have to buy another one.
I
Christmas is
recommend it.
coming. Christmas is coming. So buy it for all your friends.
Yes, I recommend it to all my friends.
Okay.
So let's begin by talking about narrative literature specifically. There's all sorts of genre in Scripture. What is it that makes narrative so unique that requires an entire book to help us to not only figure out what it means, but also how to preach it?
Well, it's the largest genre by far in the Bible, depending what you categorize as narrative, like are the Gospels narrative? Well, yes, but maybe a subcategory. Is Job narrative? Well, sort of, yeah. But depending how you categorize it, at least 60% of the Bible is narrative, and it may be 70 or more percent also. So that's one reason we want to devote ourselves to it. And secondly, much of our communication in preaching is more like what you and I are doing right now, propositional, straightforward, kind of make my point, illustrate my point. And that's great and that's cool. But narrative doesn't work that way. And so we need to learn to read according to the authorial intention, how he has breathed it out, theopneustos. We need to learn to read story well. It has its own set of standards and constraints and tools that we need for interpretation.
Yeah, one of those things is thinking through the plot of the story. I mean, you're thinking in some respects like any other literature. How would you understand it? Even though it is more than any other literature, it's God's word.
It's more, but
Beginning,
it's not less though, is it?
yeah, and so in many respects, many of the same rules apply when you're trying to interpret narratives in the Bible.
Yeah. Well, if the generic genre components of the genre of narrative are plot, character, setting, and point of view, I think plot is numero uno. It's the big kid on the block, the granddaddy. Why do I say that? Because you can tell a story without any characterization. Now, it would be weird to do that, but you could say X hated Y, and X determined to do away with Y. You don't know if X is a man and Y is a woman. You don't know if they lived in the 1800s. You don't know if they're dogs. You don't know if they're Martians. You don't know anything about the characters, but it's still, it can be a gripping story. Oh no, X is trying to do Y in. So plot is number one in what makes a story a story. And Aristotle said the same thing. He said it is the soul, the essence of narrative.
And one of the things you encourage preachers to do when digging into these narratives is to sit down and plot the story, to really figure out all the aspects of the story and to follow it along. How, in a nutshell, do you advise people to do that, and what are they supposed to glean from that?
I find it helpful to graphically draw it, like make a chart out of it. And the way in this book, the way I kind of plot is with a diagram that goes like this. Well, I'll do it from your direction. It's flat, and then it starts rising action, ding, up at the top, climax, whew, and then it falls off quickly. So the elements are background. Once upon a time, there was a guy named Jack and a girl named Jill. Nothing has really happened yet, just background. They lived in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. Then the next element is the conflict. And that is driven. First, this happens. Oh no. Then this happens. Oh no. Then this happens. Climax, the turning point, and the resolution, it falls off quickly. So I say, go ahead and draw it out. What's the background in your passage? There was a guy named Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector, and he wanted to see who Jesus was. That might be a hint about the conflict. Like, yikes! Did, does he get to meet Jesus? Does he get to see him? And then the rest of the story intensifies that. He runs ahead, he climbs a tree. Jesus finds him, he invites him over. The crowd murmurs, "Oh no, what happens? How's it all turn out?" Here's how it turns out. Climax. He met Jesus. Jesus saved him. Today's salvation has come to this house. The end. And they lived happily ever after. Except the crowd did not live happily ever after.
So it's not just admiring the art of narrative. It really is a discernment. It really is trying to figure out, hey, why is this in the Bible, and what is God trying to show us from this?
Right. The biblical authors had a whole wealth, a whole universe of details they could have included, like how old Zacchaeus was. We don't know. And where he lived in Jericho. Actually, we don't even know if he lived in Jericho. We assume he did. They don't give us all the details, but the details they do give us are there for a reason. He was rich. He was a chief tax collector, architalones. He climbed a sycamore fig tree. Why does the author bother saying it was a sycamore fig tree? What is a sycamore fig tree? And so they're there for a point, and the point they're trying to convey is theological and ethical. God is like such and such, patient, loving, holy, whatever. We are like such and such. We're seekers, we're desperate, we're sinful, we're grateful. And here's how it all works out.
One of the aspects of narrative that you mentioned is point of view. Talk
Mhm.
about why it's important to, especially from the narrator, to figure out what his point of view is, what information he knows, and how that can help us to interpret this.
Well, yes, in a sense, point of view is infused, embedded in plot, character, and setting. In other words, the narrator is telling this story from a certain standpoint, a certain point of view. It's easiest to think about this with a literal point of view, namely movie making. That is a literal point of view. Do you show the mountain from down below? Is the camera angle like this? And does the mountain fill the whole screen? Well, that produces a certain rhetorical effect in the viewer, like grandeur and wow. Or is the point of view a handheld camera in the middle of the mountain, and it's jerky and it's disorienting and you can't tell where you are on the mountain? Well, that point of view has a different effect. Or is the point of view, what is it is it a helicopter drone shot that the author is using? Well, narrators, biblical narrators, have their own set of techniques, not the camera angle, but kind of like the camera angle. For example, when Luke tells us Zacchaeus ran ahead, well, what is that showing us about Zacchaeus and his desperation? Well, it's showing us he's desperate to meet Jesus. Men didn't run in that culture. That was an activity for boys. And certainly not a man of stature, a man of the community like the chief tax collector. And yet, Luke very casually, very briefly says he ran ahead. He is showing us something, he's guiding our experience of this story.
Along with that sort of point of view, you have the idea of time. You talk about this in the book, chronological or narration time. You have narrated time. Talk
Mhm.
about the difference in those, and again, the usefulness of discerning that as far as interpretation goes.
Yeah, a biblical narrator's use of time, a manipulation. I don't say that negatively, but the way he tells the story in terms of chronology is a big factor in point of view. For example, In Mark, the story is going along like this. And then there's a flashback, which is very unusual in biblical narrative. That's more of a modern technique. But the narrator, Mark, takes us back to talk about John the Baptist. He talks about, oh, by the way, John the Baptist got thrown in jail, and Herod was real mad at him, and Herod had him beheaded, and then we come back up to present time. Okay, why does Mark, quote, manipulate time that way? What's the point in doing that? How is it, what light is he shedding on a certain doctrine or a certain point that he's making? So this is a subtle aspect of biblical narration, this manipulation of time, but it is present for those who have eyes to see and ears are open.
In your years of studying both the Old Testament and the New Testament and narrative specifically, do you see that there's really any sort of a difference in Old Testament and New Testament narrative, or is a story just a story?
There are differences. I don't get into them in this book. I'm concerned more with painting with a broad brush stroke. Every story has a plot and characters and a setting and a point of view. But some of the differences would be that the New Testament writers, narrators, are even more overtly, I guess we might say, apologetic. In other words, they're arguing. They are telling their stories to make a point, to convince us like a persuader. I think that's true in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, it's super true, especially in the Gospels. It would be true in Acts also. But in the Gospels, a prime example would be John, the end of his book. If I wrote down everything that Jesus did, oh man, the world could not contain the books. But I have selected these few incidences. Why? He tells us why he selected those few incidences, so that you might believe, and that by believing, you might have life in his name. So a very evangelistic purpose in narrating history, but very selective. And okay, what will help convince these skeptics? What will shore up the faith of these new Christians? Oh, maybe the story of feeding the 5,000. Yeah, that's a good one. And maybe the story of whatever, these different signs that John narrates.
Interesting on the topic of time, too. It shows that we have to be careful when reading the Gospels not to necessarily assume that they are written chronologically, that each story is happening in the order that it's necessarily written down by the Gospel writer.
Yeah, the synoptics are in points very different than John. And some skeptics will say, see, it's not accurate, it's not factual, it's whatever, mythological. Well, I think they need to understand the genre better. Yes, the Gospels are historical. Yes, they really happened, even the miraculous stuff. We believe in the inspiration of Scripture, but it doesn't mean they were setting out to write pure history as we know that, and this thing about chronology would be an example. They were
Uh,
apologists trying to convince the audience of a point.
yeah, each of them had a specific, there were
Yeah,
obviously many ideas, right? I mean, not just
yeah,
one, but they each had a main idea and they were packaging it together to try to get
that's
that
right.
idea across.
Yeah.
You mentioned in the book three levels of meaning. This is Fee and Stewart. Talk about that. I think there are times that we go to these stories and immediately we're looking for the human angle. We're looking for what should I or shouldn't I do based on what this character does, and it's
Yeah.
not necessarily bad, but there's more to it.
Well, Fee and Stewart wrote a classic book called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And I think that book has sold more than 400,000 copies. And this idea of three levels comes from their chapter on Old Testament narrative. So here's the idea. Every Old Testament narrative, Joseph and Potiphar's wife and Nehemiah riding his donkey around the wall and all of these stories, um, ex- uh, serve the purpose of recounting the history of Israel. Each little stone in the wall, this wall being the whole history of God's chosen people, and here's a little stone, a little pericope, a story. So they can be read at that level. It's part of how God has redeemed a people, called a people, and redeemed them and worked with them and disciplined history of Israel. Okay? Every story also is the biography of a person or a group of people. It's very, personal. It's Joseph's story, not the whole history of Israel. It's a little vignette from his life. So that's another level. Maybe that should be first as we go from specific to general. So the history, the biography of an individual, the history of a nation. And then the third level, the big one, the meta narrative, is how this story contributes to the you might say, the narrative of the whole Bible, specifically the Christ event, or God sending Jesus to save humanity, not just a person, not just even a nation, but how it fits into the big picture. And so you can read the story of Joseph through that point of view, through that perspective, or you can read about Nehemiah and regathering and rebuilding the walls from the perspective of how this fits into the grand meta narrative of God's saving his people. That's a lot packed in there, Cisco, but uh,
No, it's really good.
buy the book, read that section.
No, it's really, really good, and I'm just thinking as preachers, if you have those 3 levels, if you're digging around in the text and you're putting this all together, what's your advice as far as preaching this? Do you pick one level and preach it? Do you weave it
Good,
all
good
together?
question.
I
Yeah.
mean, that seems like a tough choice.
Yes, that is a good question. And I don't know that I have a, clear, specific answer on that. What my point is that I think it's legitimate hermeneutically to interpret and view and read the story on any of those levels, because that is the authorial intention. They intended to tell us the story of Joseph, and to tell us the history of Israel, and to tell us about how God saves the world. And so, if for your viewers here, if you find yourself preaching mostly on level one, sort of like moral lessons from the life of Joseph, there are moral lessons. He was a good guy, and he probably had faults also. But we can learn, be like Joseph, or don't be like Joseph. Go and do likewise, or go and do otherwise. I think that's legitimate. But if that's all you ever do, you may be turning Old Testament narrative into a kind of a manual for, I don't know, discipleship or something. It is not less than that, but it's more than that. The story of Joseph and Nehemiah, those are also about Jesus. So you might want to bring the camera out and say, okay, what do we learn about how God saves people? And how is Joseph perhaps like Christ or not like Christ? How is Nehemiah fitting into this meta narrative? And so that may help you be more of a Christ centered, a Christ emphasizing preacher. And it can go the other way too. If that's all you ever do is Christ centered, then you can say, well, you need to give your people some principles, how to avoid temptation, how to run, how to not lose your faith even when you get thrown in jail for doing the right thing. How to, that kind of preaching.
The stories that we've been talking about here, even just thinking about the Joseph story, yes, we're in an age of increasing biblical illiteracy. Not everyone is familiar with all of these stories, but a lot of people are. When you're preaching them, how do you maintain tension? How do you bring people along with you when they, at least many of them, are going to already know how the story ends?
Yes, that is a great question. And I find that it's actually not much of a concern. That is to say, if people already know the story, they like to hear it again. I mean, Cisco, do you ever watch reruns, or do you ever watch a movie more than once?
over and over and
Yeah,
over.
sure you do. I don't know how many times I've seen the Death Star blown up, to date myself. Um, yeah, I just came back from a long trip, and on the airplane, I was watching almost exclusively stuff I've seen before, Mission Impossible and whatever. Okay, so we like to hear stories again, even though I know how it turns out. Okay, so don't be afraid to tell the old stories, the old classics, David and Goliath, and Jesus walking on water, and all the classic stories. However, here's the flip side of that: you have to tell it well. I mean, it can be Boresville if your retelling is flat and they don't imagine themselves and feel the tension that David must have felt, and to paint the scene. So you need to use good language and good delivery, and maybe throw in some new exegetical insights that you've discovered in your own study. And if you do that, people say, "Yeah, go on, tell me the story. I love to hear that story." Okay. Now, the same is true for people that don't know the story. As you say, that's an increasing percentage. You might need to give more background. Like, there was a guy named David. Don't just assume they know. He was one of the kings. He was probably the best king of Israel way back 2,000 or more than 1,000, yeah, 3,000 years ago. And King David was a nobody. He was a shepherd boy, but here's how he rose, to become the king of Israel. So that kind of background can help uh, place the story in their minds. You can also use analogy. This is like that. David's rise to the kingship is like, find your analogy, like Abraham Lincoln or something. He was a rail splitter. He was a nobody, but he progressed up through the ranks.
When it comes to sort of keeping the audience's attention, bringing them along with you, voice, stage presence. You mentioned the language that you use. You don't want to think of this as theater necessarily, and yet there are similarities, at least in some of the techniques that you can
Yeah,
use in order to
yeah,
get people engaged.
right. The art of acting, theater overlaps with any oral communication, by the way, including what you and I are doing right now, but certainly with preaching, and especially with narrative style preaching, retelling the story. In their opposite ends, the two arts are, quite different, but there's that area of overlap. So yes, imagine, maybe use, blocking positions on the stage, practice your gestures, maybe use some background slides or something. All of that is very helpful in bringing the story alive.
Every time I begin a preaching class at Moody, one of the very first things that I say to students is, "You can preach without notes, and you will." Uh, the reason I say that is because that's what my seminary professor said to me the first day of class, and it freaked me out.
Yeah.
But indeed, I could do it, and I do it. When it comes to narrative messages, is it even more important that we try to preach without notes in order to make it engaging for people? I mean, we're telling stories here.
It probably is even more important, or maybe it's just as important for a different set of reasons. Um, in storytelling, people don't want to be read to. Uh, they want the illusion of the first time, the like sitting around a campfire telling a story, and reading it is an unnecessary barrier that reminds people this is scripted, this is prepared. It doesn't have that uh, flint striking, the steel striking the flint of human thought and emotion. And so I say you should preach, especially narrative sermons, with limited notes or maybe even no notes. If you do a first person narrative, "Hi, my name is Joseph. Let me tell you my story," then you really can't use any notes or very few notes. With a third person narrative, "There was a guy named Joseph," you can probably use limited notes, but do keep it limited.
Yeah, the first person narrative, it's one that we have students do on a fairly regular
Mhm,
basis. They're always
mhm.
sort of skittish at the
Do
beginning.
you require them to do it?
I do. I require them
Yeah.
to do it, and they just like the no notes thing. They kind of freak out a little bit,
Mhm,
and yet they're able to do it. And and I've always thought, even if they don't end up doing it in ministry
mhm.
someday, there's a new dimension to understanding the character and the
Yeah,
development and just the emotion of what's
yeah.
going on in the story that going through that exercise produces in the person who's preparing the message.
It requires us to add a new tool to our exegetical tool belt, namely imagination. That should probably be there all the time, whether you're in an epistle or certainly a psalm. But if you are preaching with the voice, the point of view of a character in the story, you've got to see the world through that person's eyes. How did Zacchaeus feel when he was up in the tree? How did he, you know, how did he feel when the crowd murmured against him? And so that calls for imagination.
Yeah, and that allows you too, I think, to really connect with the audience on that deeply human level,
Mhm,
in just a different way.
mhm.
Well, this is really great help, Jeff. You've been generous with your time, and so I'll end it here. But I'll say once again, the book "How to Preach Narrative." Why don't you pick up a copy? See if you can possibly highlight it more than I have. I don't know if that's possible. I really I appreciate any time I get to talk to you, Jeff. Thanks for
Thank
spending just
you.
a few minutes with me.
Great to see you. Lord bless you, all of you, with your preaching and teaching ministries.